Happy Wednesday, everyone. Meteorologist John Homenuk with Empire Weather here with your latest long-range agriculture forecast update. A lot to go through today. I am mobile, traveling this afternoon, but have the full setup here with me, so if there are any audio issues, please let me know. I think I should have them figured out. But getting into some details on the upcoming pattern, it's always important to start with where we have been. And if we look at the last 30 days, it's very clear where we've had issues. The main problem has been across the southern plains, from Texas Panhandle up into parts of Kansas, down into Oklahoma, even extending into parts of Missouri and Arkansas. This area has been extremely dry and is forecast to remain quite dry, and this is obviously the area of broad concern over the next couple of weeks. There's also been some areas that have remained drier in the Ohio Valley despite the rains from last week. We broke these down last week, but we'll get into a little more detail on them here. Parts of Iowa still at 50% or less of precipitation over the last 30 days of normal precipitation, and then we have a corridor from central Minnesota into Wisconsin as well. This area saw some scattered rain yesterday, but nothing near what they need. And then we also have this area extending down into parts of Illinois from Indiana and Ohio, southern Indiana and parts of Kentucky as well. You can see there are definitely some problem spots here that will linger. And as we move into a pattern that is becoming increasingly warm, these areas are going to become a focus of attention. Looking at the last month, or 2 months, this is from May into July. This is the area that has been dry, and this kind of matches up with what we just saw, right? We see these areas that are having drier than normal conditions. Texas, obviously into parts of Arkansas and Missouri that we just talked about having a really hard time here. Parts of Kansas and Nebraska as well. So I guess the takeaway really that we want to get to here is that there are still areas that are drier than normal. And when we look at a map like this one, and if we back it up and look at the country in general, when we look at a map like this one and we consider that a lot of this area here, because of the later planting this year, is still dealing with a crop that's approaching pollination, and we look at these areas that have been drier than normal over the last 30 days and are still dealing with some moisture deficits, you start to realize quickly that there's not that much wiggle room or room for error in the weather pattern, and that's what leads to the concern moving forward. And part of the reason why we're so focused on basically every individual storm cluster. So let's look at those storm clusters and let's look at what's going on in the weather pattern here. Here's a European model for Thursday night, and I want to draw your attention to a couple things. First of all, the weather pattern is still generally the same that it's been over the last couple of days. We have a ridge developing and expanding here in the four corners. We know we have lots of moisture kind of just sitting here. That moisture is being taken from underneath this ridge and being circled around it and over the top of it. And then we have this gradient right here where we're seeing Pacific disturbances come up and ride. These are your ridge running storms. And so the troughing that's existed in the Northeast has kept the drier northwest flow in place across the belt for the last couple of days. But on Thursday evening, we'll see a disturbance that models as of a couple of days ago did not pick up on. And all of a sudden, you see this disturbance emerge out of the Canadian storm track, and it comes over the top here, and this moisture and instability feeds into it. And you can see the disturbance come down here. This is valid now early Friday morning. These disturbances act as lift in the atmosphere, upward rising motion. And when you have moisture that's sitting here along an axis in this area, and you get this area of lift to move in, what eventually happens is storms develop. And so when we look at the moisture forecast and we look at the dew points, you can really visualize exactly where the highway for these storms to track along is. You have drier air down here in parts of the central plains. You have drier air here to the north and east, at least initially, but this moisture is feeding in and allowing that storm complex to develop from the Dakotas and Minnesota and then drop down here into the Midwest. Now, where that storm cluster tracks is obviously going to be really, really critical. And I want to take a look at the 3-hourly precipitation on the European model and zoom into the central United States, into the Ohio Valley. Let's back this up to look at when the storms initially form. So your initial development period here is late Thursday into Friday, and it occurs across parts of the Dakotas and Minnesota. That's where that lift exists. Now, the models have an axis of instability in the atmosphere that is draped down here into parts of Iowa and into parts of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. And so that supports this storm cluster tracking south and east like the models suggest it will. And you can see the European model tracking it right into that axis of instability. As we get into Friday morning, the complex might weaken a bit because this is all thunderstorm activity, and we're expecting it to weaken at least a little bit as it continues its track south and east. We'll probably see some regeneration of it late Friday afternoon across parts of Illinois and Indiana, but it's also possible that it becomes less widespread as it tracks down through that region. So that's the first storm complex that moves through. And here's the European totals on that storm complex. So here's your track of the heaviest activity. You can see it very clearly. There's some secondary showers and storms that develop in parts of Iowa, but this is really the area that we're monitoring for this storm track. And obviously the details of exactly where this tracks is going to be critical, because a slight eastward shift would take much of Iowa here out of that rainfall. The current feeling is that western and possibly even central Iowa are going to miss out on this precipitation. It's more likely that this rainfall ends up angling from the Dakotas into Minnesota, parts of central and eastern Iowa, and then down into Illinois and Indiana, as well as parts of Wisconsin as this storm system tracks down. Just to take a look at the European ensemble from last night, you can see exactly where the European ensemble tracks this disturbance as well. And the core of that is right where we had discussed it likely will be, from Minnesota into northeastern Iowa, then down into Illinois, Indiana, including parts of Wisconsin. And so we will be tracking that disturbance with you. And obviously, it's an important one as we move into this weekend. Now, backing up again, I want to go back to the operational model real quick to look at the synoptic setup and what's happening, because the models redevelop another complex of storms late Saturday into Sunday. So let's go back to that same indicator we used earlier, and I'll back up to the national view so we can really get a good look. Remember that lift I was talking about? Well, here's the first disturbance that tips off the storms on Friday. That slides down to the south and east. And guess what? There's another one right behind it. Here it is, coming down across the Dakotas and Nebraska and tracking to the south and east into the Ohio Valley. And so the models are picking up on that disturbance, producing another sequence of storms. This is Saturday into Sunday. This one is going to have a boost, and it's going to come from all the moisture that's sitting here in the southeast states, because once it starts returning up into this complex, you're going to feed off that and develop the possibility of rainfall over a broad area. Operational European model, as of this afternoon, produces big rains in parts of Missouri, into parts of southern and central Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. This would be huge from Saturday into Sunday. This is ending Monday morning. You can see that lingering area of rainfall just kind of hanging out, and it eventually makes its way off to the East Coast. So by the time we're all said and done here on the European model, on Tuesday morning, early Tuesday morning, if we zoom back in and look at the Ohio Valley view, the European model says, hey, a lot of this area is going to have received some pretty substantial precipitation, and this would take a lot of the edge off of the medium range pattern. This is the focus region right here for storms. We talked about this earlier, right? This is the track. This is the area of the track. We know we have those disturbances coming. The confidence is rising that these storm clusters will occur. However, there's a reason why there's so much sensitivity around these clusters. I'm going to show you exactly why. Let's go back and look at what's going on with the sea surface temperatures across the globe. So we know we have the trade winds that are just continually reinforcing the La Nina, right? These trade winds are just buzzing here through the Central Pacific. We have some cooler waters off the coast of South America, some temporarily warmer waters upwelling here, but overall the La Nina is still in control, likely to remain in control. However, we have lost, and I mentioned this in the video on Monday, we have lost the cooler waters off the coast of North America. And that's important because it's going to shift ridging propensity to the west. So instead of having a ridge developing right north of Hawaii and a trough off the west coast, we're now going to shift that ridging north and west and develop it northwest of Hawaii. That puts troughing off the U.S. East Coast and allows ridging to expand in the Four Corners region and perhaps into parts of the plains. And it also introduces in that waveguide, if I draw this waveguide for you, it also introduces the possibility of troughing in the Northeast states as we move into late July. So let's look at what the models are saying is going to happen. Right, so here's the European ensemble as we move into the later part of June, and we get what appears to be a pretty substantial disturbance coming out of the Pacific over the top of this ridge, right? Look at the flow here. This thing comes over the top here and down into the Great Lakes. There's likely going to be at least some storm opportunities kind of aligned with the movement of this disturbance as it moves into New England. We have a northwest flow. We have Pacific moisture coming over the top here. So we'll get some relief there from the big heat, at least through that time frame. Afterwards, the models are building a larger and more expansive ridge after the 20th of July across the south central plains into Four Corners region. But watch where this ridge goes. It forms and starts backing up to the west. This is what we just talked about, right? We just talked about why that would happen because we don't have the cool waters here anymore. They're over here. So your ridging develops northwest of Hawaii. Your trough is almost further west in the Gulf of Alaska, and your ridge center, instead of being in this region, shifts to the west to be further in this region as well. So that's something to really keep in mind as we move forward and the models resolve these individual periods. Now, one thing is for sure, we're going to see the expansion of substantial warmth across the plains. So if we look at the European model last night, we'll look at the ensemble. So this is the mean of 51 different ensemble members. We're going to start to really see that warmth expand here as we move past mid-month. The first surge of it comes really from the 17th into the 18th, and you can see it expanding across a huge portion of the ag belt. Now, these temperatures are averaged for the day, right? These 7 to 10 degree above normal temperatures are impressive enough in the summer, but they're averaged out for the day. So let's zoom in here, and I want to show you the importance of why this warmth adds some concern. Is if you zoom into this region and you look at the minimum temperatures, I'm going to pull up what the model is showing for the minimum temperatures here. So for example, your minimum temperatures as forecast for the 19th of July, for the 24 hours prior, there is a enormous region here where the model is telling you that the minimum temperature will be 70 degrees or above. And we know the importance of that for a crop, right? This whole area is seeing minimum temperatures that are warmer than 70 degrees overnight. And it's much of the same moving forward. Just looking at the 20th here, so many areas are over 70 degrees here. This is substantial warmth. It's not just warm during the day and cool at night. It's substantial warmth. And the models are really honing in on that. We don't see signals like this for warmth this widespread all that often, and it continues. This is valid from the 24th to the 25th. We're still looking at widespread warmth across a huge area. And that's the reason why we've been focused and talking over and over about these storm clusters, because it can turn ugly quickly when you have this warmth, especially overnight lows that are in the lower to mid 70s across a huge area. But despite the warmth, when we look at the overall weather pattern and how it is developing on models, there is confidence that we will see those storm clusters. So again, I want us to focus on the 5-day. We're going to average this out over 5 days. And so the warmth builds, right? But when we look at this forecast through the latter part of July, the ridge center is here in the Four Corners. This is the center of your ridge axis. And for a huge majority of the agriculture belt, that places us on the periphery of this ridging, which we know is where these ridge running storms like to track. They like to come over the top of the ridge. When we have the moisture that we have in place and we look at the model forecast here for precipitable water, which tells us the moisture content in the atmosphere, this shows us a similar pattern to the one we had a couple weeks ago, where this moisture is just kind of in this reservoir in the Four Corners. It's coming over the top of this reservoir and into parts of the agriculture belt. And so all this is to say that at least through about the 25th of July, we anticipate that there will be chances for storms. Now, that doesn't guarantee that everyone's going to see storms, but there should be chances for storms. I wanted to talk quickly about ensembles because ensemble data has a tough time with storms. It has a tough time picking out these individual complexes. One of the main reasons why is because there's 51 ensemble members in here trying to pick up on individual thunderstorm clusters. And so when you look at a pattern in the extended range, you look at this with your eyes and say, oh, that's generally drier than normal. But in reality, the individual members might be showing storm clusters coming out of this general region into the ag belt. And that's why we use the tools that we have, such as the atmospheric flow and the moisture content, to give us a better idea as to where these storms might or might not be heading. So that's through mid-month, or taking us through about the 20th or 25th. But I do want to note that there is some periods of time in here that could be drier than others. And when the ridge flexes up, that's when we look at the possibility of concern. If there was a region I was most concerned about at this moment, it would be continually the western belt. Obviously, we've been talking for months about the big concern down here in this general region in the southern plains and the Arlatex. This area has been extremely dry. We've talked about this. There is a huge concern in this area. They are really suffering, and the forecasts moving forward do not offer any help for this area. The ridging forms overhead in this region and backs up to the west, which only hurts them because it keeps the flow around the ridge and sends the moisture up out of that area. And it's not looking like there's going to be much help to come in this general vicinity. But the second area of concern is on the periphery of the storm track. So that would be from southeastern South Dakota into western, possibly central and southwestern Iowa, maybe parts of southern and western Illinois and Indiana, and then Missouri, as well as parts of Kansas and Nebraska. This is the area that I want to monitor really closely because it won't take much of a move in the storm track to take this area away from the moisture and keep the storms coming out of the Canadian storm track down into this general region. This area has a pretty large percentage of production. And so I just am worried that if this ridge were to grow any more expansive, we would have problems. And this is an area that we really need to watch right here. This corridor is an area that we need to be very careful with moving forward. If we look at the models moving forward and we look at the European 5-day precipitation anomalies, you can see why that region will be the area of concern. Because even, let's pull up 10-day as an example. Even with the storms that we have coming up, and you can see them appearing here with this little hole in the precipitation departures, it's this region right here. This is the area that still is in concern because the storm track is coming from this monsoon over the top of that area and into the Ohio Valley. And, if this creeps any further into the north and east, we'll start to be looking at an area that is a little bit concerning as we move into late July, especially given how dry it's been. Looking at the extended forecast, here's the European weeklies taking us through the end of July and into early August. And the one thing that you continue to notice is the pattern remains stagnant. We talked about the MJO not giving us much help from a tropical forcing perspective and sort of chilling the pattern out. This ridge actually amplifies further to the north and west. So you'll see warmth expanding again across this general region. And then that will also allow these Pacific disturbances to come over the top and down into the Great Lakes and Northeast. So I still think that as we move into the early part of very late July and early part of August, that there will be some risk that parts of the Northeast actually trend a bit cooler and more active, and we'll have to see if that actually comes to fruition. If we look at the temperature forecasts on the European weeklies, you can kind of get a hint of that, right? The warmth that was extending out all the way into the Northeast kind of backs off a little bit. You can see this cooler air kind of pooling out here, and the warmth sends itself north and westward into parts of the upper Midwest and northern plains, the high plains region, as we move into early and mid-August. From a precipitation standpoint, the weeklies offer some hints as to a second pathway out of this dryness, right? So we have the initial storm track, we talked about that, and the risk here. This is the risk over the next 2 weeks. But look what happens as we move into August on the weeklies. This moisture here in the eastern United States starts to back itself up into the Ohio Valley. So what does that pathway mean? Let's look at the atmospheric pattern, right? Here's what's going on. Across the Atlantic, and I'm going to back this up. I want to look at North America so you can see what's going on. This is called the Western Atlantic Ridge. And when the ridge is centered here, the flow around a ridge of high pressure is clockwise. And so this takes moisture from the Caribbean and moves it up into the eastern U.S., while this troughing here takes additional moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. So when you start to back that up and we move into this time frame here in early August, the return flow around any high pressure that forms here is going to be this way, right? It's going to come out of the Atlantic and Caribbean and into the Ohio Valley. And so when we back up again and look at precipitation, this makes some sense. That would be a pathway where this area would start to see some more moisture in early August. And I think that's something to really, really watch and be careful of. Again, we talked about the risk areas in mid to late July, right? It's the same area. It's the same plains, possibly extending into parts of Iowa and western Illinois, Missouri, and then back into the plains as well. And we'll likely see that expand northward as the ridging expands northward, right? So look at how this ridge has started to push to the north by the time we get into early August. That opens up the door here for moisture to come back into the Ohio Valley, but it's still concerning for this general region because it's uncertain how they will fare with individual storm clusters. It also opens the door, if this ridge moves further north, for some tropical activity to start to get going in the Gulf and Caribbean, but we'll leave that for another day, discussion for another time. Euro seasonal came out this week, and as we look at what it shows for July, this is pretty much what we just talked about, right? We have the active signal to the east, we have this concern area which works in here, and we have the storm track, the Canadian storm track down here through the northern plains into the Midwest, so not much change from what we knew. Again, this is the focus area, folks. We have the storm clusters coming this week and weekend. We broke them down earlier in the video into this region, and we have the dryness persisting into parts of the plains, western Iowa, possibly west and southwestern Illinois. And this is going to be the area that I am concerned about moving forward. It's right on the periphery, and when we look at the position of the ridging, it is not going to take much. Right now, everything looks okay, but it is not going to take that much for this area here to end up on the wrong side of things. And we really need to watch that moving forward. We'll be with you every day moving forward. Obviously, every individual storm cluster matters, and we will break them all down for you as we move through the rest of this week. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. We're here all day to help you. Have a great Wednesday. We'll be back with another long-range video tomorrow on Thursday. Talk to you soon, guys.